Welcome. Today we will start off actually playing around a little bit in Unreal Engine and learning how to navigate. We will learn how to manipulate objects, move them around, scale them, rotate them. Um, we will build a very simple level together and just basically get our feet in the water and start getting acquainted with how the navigation and the Unreal Engine works when it comes to interacting with objects. So let's start off with some basic navigation. If you use your mouse and you hold on left mouse key when you're in the main viewport, and then you drag your mouse while you have your left mouse key pressed down, then you will notice that your camera or your view will twist around from left to right. It will pan. If you on the other hand hold down your middle mouse button and do the same thing, then you will see that it will lock its rotation in a direction and it will move around that rotation. If you instead hold down your right mouse button and do the same, you will see that you can freeform look around in different directions. In addition to this, if you hold down your right mouse button and you use the WASD keys, you can strafe sideways and you can move backwards and forwards. So while my preferred method of navigating around the world personally is that I hold down the right mouse button, then I look around to see where I want to go, and I use W to move forward, or S to move backwards, or A and D to strafe left and right to navigate myself quickly around the world to get where I want to be, or to get the certain perspective that I want to have to see what I want to see. So now that you know the basic controls, now would be a good time to just play around with it a little bit, move around a little bit, get a feel for how it works, so that you feel comfortable moving around without having any issues with moving from one certain spot to a different spot in the world. Okay, so let's start off with actually selecting an object in the world. Let's move our mouse cursor over a box like this one and left click on it. This will bring up a highlight around the object showing that it is currently selected. And you immediately notice that it brings up this blue arrow and this green arrow, which turn yellow when I hover over them. This object is sometimes referred to a gizmo. It is a sort of like an anchor that's connected to the object that you have selected, showing you the different dimensions that you can manipulate it in. So we have a red arrow also now that's a little bit more clear now that we've changed our vantage point. The red arrow corresponds to the x-axis in the world. The green arrow corresponds to the y-axis and the blue corresponds to the z-axis. If at any point you ever want to know which axis is connected to which one, you can always see a very handy little overview down here that will always show you the directions you are in relation to your camera view. So these arrows, they represent the movement command or the move option for a specific object that you have selected in the world. So if we were to left click on this object, then you would see that the mouse pointer turns into a hand. This means that we have currently grabbed it. What this means is that if we now move the mouse, it will start moving along an axis, and the axis it corresponds to is the one that we grabbed. So by picking one of these axes and then grabbing it, we choose to control it along that axis, which can be very helpful if you want to keep this box, for example, aligned with the ground. So if we want to move it along the ground in this direction, we pick the red arrow and we drag it around. Then maybe we want to move it a little bit to the left here, and then we take the green arrow and we move it in that direction. You can also be a little bit more advanced if you want to move it, for example, along the ground in its entirety, but don't want to move it in one specific axis at a time. You can always pick the little angle here that meets the green and the red. When you hover over it, it will light up, showing you that both of these axes will be available to you as the lock when you start dragging it around. So if I click now and the hand appears, I can now drag it along and it will move along all the axes except for the Z one. In the same way, you can pick one that's between the green and the blue, meaning that it will move sideways and upwards, but not in depth in my viewpoint right now, like this. And there's a third one for the blue one and the red one with similar properties. So it moves along the blue and the red at the same time, but not the green. If you wanted a complete freeform, you could always go for the center. If you move to the center and hold down, you will allow it to be moved in all the different angles that are available, which can be a bit problematic to actually maneuver around with. So moving it along one axis or two axes at a time is probably better. From here, we can also choose to change to a different mode. We are currently in the movement mode, which is also symbolized up here. We can see select and translate objects. Translation is generally the descriptor when it comes to saying that you want to move something around. We do have two other ways of manipulating objects as well, and those are the rotate and the scale. If we click on the rotate button, we can see that our arrows disappear and we now get sort of 90-degree angles in different colors. These again corresponds, like before, towards the angles Z, Y and X, but you can see that the numbers have, or the colors have been changed. And the reason for that is that the blue now corresponds to you saying that you want to rotate this object, but you want to rotate it along the Z-axis. Z-axis being upwards, meaning that if we turn along the Z-axis, it will turn like the Z-axis was the center point and we want to spin it around it. If we do it around the red, we see that it's the X-axis, which is going in this direction to the right, and the object will spin around that axis. You can also see that while I am actually rotating the object, you get an overview saying a number, showing a number between -30, -20, -10, 0. This represents the rotation that you have currently made from the starting point that you began with. So if you want to rotate, for example, let's see, say a quarter rotation around the Z-axis, then you could take and grab the blue and then drag the mouse until you get 90 degrees, and then you have moved exactly a quarter around its axis. Similarly, for the green, the blue and the red, there's also a green one which works in the same way. Lastly, we have the scale. Scale appears to be similar to the arrows we had when we were translating or moving the object. The difference here is that if we grab one of these and then start dragging the mouse, you can see that it will expand or detract, depending on where you move the mouse, along the axis that we choose. So the axis that we grab is the one that we're locking. So if we take the red, we will be scaling and scaling down along the red axis, which is the x-axis. And if we were to do the same thing as we did with the arrows when we were translating, you can grab in between two axes to make it scale or scale down along those axes. And similarly, you can pick in the middle to get a uniform scale between all three axes, which is pretty good normally, because then you can keep the same dimensions, and making an object that's meant to be looking in a certain way, it will keep its uniform look even though you're making it bigger or smaller. That should be pretty much it when it comes to translation, rotation and scaling. But before we move on, I want to show also a hotkey when it comes to this. If you have an object and you quickly want to change between moving, rotating, scaling, and you don't want to click these buttons up here, you can always press either W, which represents the translating, or E, which will move you to rotation, and R, which will go to scaling. So clicking these buttons will quickly allow you to change between these different modes, and you can quickly get into a habit of rotating and then translating and then scaling according to your needs. When it comes to the movement, the translation, the rotation and the scaling of an object in the world, there are some things that you might want to keep in mind or have as a reference. So if we click on this cube, for example, here, and we want to translate this object and we go upwards, the first thing we want to know is that it seems like it does it incrementally. It does it in a non-fluid way. It's sort of like jumping a certain amount of steps. The reason for that is that both translation, rotation and scaling in the engine is normally set to a snapping mode, which means that it will use a certain amount of units that it will allow you to jump between for each step that you drag, translate, rotate or scale an object. So this object that I'm moving around, for example, has a snapping set to 10. So this is the value that is active when you're moving. Correspondingly, for rotation, you have this amount of degrees that it will snap for each step that you rotate. And for scaling, this is the value that it uses when you scale around. If you want to have something more freeform, you can just click the orange button and it will deactivate the snapping, and you can move without having it activated. And all of these orange buttons here correspond to the different ones. So this one is the one for scaling, this one is the one for rotation, and this one is the one for transforming. The snapping can be very good because it can be used, for example, to quickly align something very precisely to a different object. So if I were to move this one a little bit up, it's very easy for me to get it back to the exact same spot where it's very snug against the floor. But if you for some reason want to have it more fluidly moving, or you want more precision with it, you just remove the snapping, and then you'll see that it's very fluid when you're moving it around. However, now I run into the trouble of I'm not entirely sure exactly when I'm flush with the ground anymore. There is a solution around this particular problem. If you have an object in the world and you want it to go from being in a floating state like this, and you want to move it downwards until it meets an object underneath it, you can just press the end key and it will realign in the bottom. In addition to that, there is also, like we discussed earlier, in the Details tab, information about this selected object's current transform, rotation and scale, and we find that over here. On the right hand side here we can see this particular object has a very specific X location, a Y location and a Z location. And this can also be used to transform, rotate or scale an object. So if you want to move this highlighted box up in the air, we can go from being 295 to something like 350, and we'll see it rise up in the air along that axis. This works for all the axes in location, and you can do the same for rotation. So if I go and say I want to have a 30-degree rotation around the z-axis, I just press enter after inputting my value, and then you'll see the cube will rotate around that axis. When it comes to scale, you have a little bit of a different behavior. You can go in here and say that instead of you want 2.5 magnifier, you want to have something 5, and then press enter, and you'll see that it becomes huge. But you might notice that it actually stayed uniform, and the reason for this is this little lock that's sitting beneath next to scale. This lock, when it's active, will allow you to change any of the values for scale, and the other values will change along with it. So if I change this to 4, all the other will change to 4. This is because most of the time you want to change something in a very uniform way so that everything follows along. But if you for some reason don't want to do that, you can just click on this little lock and you'll see that it's open, which will allow you to input a specific number in one of these, and it will not affect the values of the other axis. Okay, I think it's time to play around a little bit with what we have learned. So let's make a little simple level from the knowledge that we have. And while we're doing that, we can learn a few more tricks along the way as well. So let's say we want to build a little platform. Let's say we want to take this and we scale it so it's a little bit thinner. This will be the platform that we will be standing on at some point. We'll move it around a little bit. Maybe we want this platform to be stationed upon some objects, so we'll move some boxes to be underneath it. And now we have this box over here. We might be thinking, well, I want another box, but I don't want to pick another box from over here. Well, what you can do is, if you hold down one of the axes, and this works for both transform, rotation, and for scaling, and you hold down your Alt key and click and move, then you'll see that you're not actually dragging the object that you had in the beginning, you're actually duplicating the object and then moving it or rotating it and scaling it from that position. So if I were to move this object over here, and then I go to the rotation, for example, and then I hold down Alt and I rotate, we see a new object appear. I choose to change the transform, I move it out of the way, and we have another object over here. Then we'll do the last, so we have a sort of a uniform, although quite ugly little platform right here. It looks a little bit unstable. Maybe we want a way to be able to get up to this platform. Let's see here, we should have some geometry. We can take a linear stair, and we'll drag it out into the world. This one looks a little bit different, and we'll go into that in a later tutorial, but for now we can move this one around just like the other one. It will just look a little bit different while in the movement phase, but it is functional just the same. There we go. I have created a little crooked platform that you can move up along the staircase and get on top of, and look around if you want to. Let's give it a try. We go and click the play button, and we immediately notice that the whole world is just falling apart and flying away. This is a slight mistake by my hand, but I can explain what's going on here. The reason this is happening is because these objects are actually physics objects, and maybe when I put all of these things together they were not as snug or as perfectly aligned as I wanted them to be, so then they started interacting physically. So we'll do the same thing, however we'll use some different objects that are not as physically interactable, so it doesn't explode like that. So let's get to these objects then, and we'll select each object by left clicking and then holding down Control and left clicking another one, and you'll see that both of them are highlighted now. While doing so, we keep on holding down Control when left clicking on a new object, and we'll add all of these objects to our selection. Now that we have selected all of these objects, what we want to do is go over here to Mobility and click on either Stationary or Static. That way they will not be interacted with physicality like we had happened before. So let's see how this works now for us. We again press the play button. We end up in the world and our boxes are not exploding and flying all over the sky again. Awesome. We can walk up the stairs, we can stand on the objects, and we can look around if we want to. Everything is working excellent. This would be a good opportunity for you to play around with making a little level for yourself. You can make it as simple or as advanced as you want to, but try to play around with all the different modes of moving objects, rotating objects, scaling objects. Make a little level that you can play with, and also try using it both in snapping and non-snapping modes. But before I let you continue, there is one more thing I think I should let you know before you continue, and that is that when you are in a mode of having an item selected, you can see that the angles or the axis of this object correspond to the world down in the bottom left down here. And it's not aligned with the actual object itself, which means that when you're moving this object around, it's difficult to get it in a way that you want to have it. You have to have it aligned like with an angle so it corresponds to the axis in the bottom. There are ways around this, and that is to make this perfectly clear. I'll rotate this a bit more. You have something called World Transform and Object Transform. So when you have this button where the mouse hovered over as a globe, that means that you're going to have your axis aligned to the world, and if you click this, it will have its axis aligned to how the objects have its axis. So if you ever end up in a situation where you don't have the ability to move items properly, either by the object level or the world level, and you want to change, this button up here is the one you want to click on to change to a different mode. So proceed with playing around, making a level, and getting acquainted with the different ways of interacting. There! Hopefully by now you've created a little bit of a level, and hopefully it's something you're proud of. Good job on making your first level. What we are currently doing is something that's called gray boxing. It is a way of creating sort of a simplistic version of a level, because it's easier to get a feel for how a level is supposed to work, where you're supposed to go, the flow of it, and how the different environments will interact with each other, and you can get like jump distances corrected and stuff like that. The reason you do it as a quote-unquote gray boxing is because it's quicker and easier to get a very basic feel and a prototype out first. So it's a very good it's good behavior to start making things in a gray boxing way before you start adding assets later on. Although assets make the levels much prettier, it will be much more problematic to change a level when you've put like all the final touches already in there, instead of having made a more rugged basic prototype first, and then once you're happy with the prototype you can enhance and make it prettier and make it more perfect, basically. So yeah, I think that's it for now. Hopefully you found this video helpful. In the next video we will be starting to learn about materials. If you liked this video, leave a like. If you disliked it, leave a dislike. Leave any suggestions or comments you have down below about what you think about this video or what you would like to see in the future. Subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Keep on learning. Take care.